how utterly bizarre an experience this is for me right now. I am essentially sat alone in my room talking to myself for what will be the best part of an hour. Hopefully, not entirely to myself. I will happily take questions, but just because of the nature of how this is going to be running, if you could save those questions to the end, I'll try and cover those when we, with a little bit of time at the end of the session. The second thing is I aim all of these talks at people who do not have any previous experience of not just built heritage, but also archaeology in general. So if there's anything that you feel like you already know, just hang around. It's just to make sure that everyone is caught up to the same speed and that we can all go through and get as much out of this as possible. I also, and that includes introducing the participants who have sponsored the Layers of London talks that I've been doing at various sites prior to going online. The first of those obviously is the Layers of London and the Institute of Historical Research. I'd particularly like to draw attention to Layers of London. If you have not had a chance to go on their website, I can thoroughly support that you do so. It's a really interesting tool of being able to investigate the environment around you, which is an incredibly important part of understanding the built heritage, the built landscape and historic buildings. It's a really powerful tool, lots of historical maps. You can add your own layers to them. It's a really useful tool, so I suggest if you get a chance after this to go and have a look at it. And the organisation that I represent is Museum of London Archaeology. I am the Community Engagement Project Officer there, but I've also worked as a historic standing buildings specialist. And as you can see from this one, we do commercial services. We're a commercial archaeology unit, which is an idea that we will briefly cover in a second. But we also do things like this, the outreach, community engagement, and research side of things. So that is everyone involved. I'm Paul. Please feel free to ask questions at the end, and let's learn about historic standing buildings. So, what is standing buildings archaeology? Because when people ask or talk about archaeology, there tends to be a very specific idea in their heads. They're either thinking, oh, Indiana Jones, entirely wrong, or they're thinking about something like Time Team or Digging for Britain, the idea of excavating trenches in the ground to look for material culture objects that have been made by past societies to use as evidence to rebuild an understanding of that society reflected through the physical evidence. They don't tend to think about using those same principles, the same techniques that are employed in excavation in the understanding of historic standing buildings. But they are very similar techniques at play. If you want to take away anything from this session, the idea of stratigraphy is a really important one. Now, stratigraphy is kind of a core element of archaeology. In its most basic terms, it means that the thing at the bottom is the oldest, and then through various different processes of dumping layers, destruction, deliberately building up land, etc., more layers of material are built up and built up and built up. And when an archaeologist comes to investigate a site, they dig off each layer in turn to understand and unpick all of the processes that came to producing the site as we know it today. Historic standing buildings use very similar technique. In fact, pretty much the same technique. We just call it phasing. There you go, you've learned something already. But with phasing, it uses exactly the same idea. Slightly different terminology. What you're looking for when you're phasing a building is you're trying to find the principal build, the first part of the structure that was put up. And then it uses the same idea of once you have that principal structure, if you build a wall, that has to exist first before you build anything into it, onto it, up against it, or through it, all right? And once you understand how all of those different sections of a building work together, you can, like an archaeological site, unpick the history and the development of the structure. So that, at its very core, is what historic standing buildings archaeology is. And everything else that I'm going to talk to you about is just being able to express that very simple core understanding. Why do we record is a question that is probably quite pertinent. One reason that we record is that in the UK, it is a legal requirement to carry out an archaeological survey. And as you can see here, it was a building, not a standing building, but a building that actually sort of kick-started the move for there to be protection under law for archaeology. Prior to 1989, there really wasn't much in the way of legal protection. There wasn't a requirement for people who were excavating a site to necessarily do anything with any archaeology that they may find. All of this changed with the discovery on the South Bank and the excavation of the Rose Playhouse. Like most other archaeological sites of the era, the plan was to dig through it and to build flats. But because of the high-profile nature of it, they were allowed archaeologists. They sort of said, yes, you can come and have a look at it before we get rid of it. Unfortunately, word of the site got out, and it sort of angered the most powerful protest group in England, old white actors, who were out on the streets and were led by a pre-Sir Ian McKellen. Sort of means that archaeology in the UK is only protected under law because Ian McKellen stood in front of a bulldozer and said, "Who shall not pass?" This led to questions being asked in Parliament. And very quickly, the planning policy guidance 15 and 16 were passed. And this essentially set up the framework for what commercial archaeology would become. And in its very basic form, it said that if there is potential or known archaeology on a site that a developer wants to work on, then the developer is responsible for paying for the archaeology to be done. That leads to commercial archaeology units setting up, like MOLA and other departments, and then they tender for contracts on a site, much like any other business on a site. Same as a plumber would put in for a contract, an archaeology firm will do the same thing. And they will discharge the planning conditions that say that the archaeology on this site needs to be investigated. This was obviously revisited, and what we currently have is the National Planning Policy Framework, March 2012, which we have down here, if you want to have a look at that yourselves. But essentially it says that the historic environment and any historical buildings have to be investigated, and also the evidence needs to be made publicly accessible, which is sort of the kind of thing that we're doing here. That covers the investigation of historic buildings as well, so that if you are going to make a change to a building, or you're going to potentially alter any of the fabric of it, you as the developer also have to pay for archaeological work to understand that structure. So that is the legal framework that all of this recording work is based upon. And once you understand that, you don't have to think about it again. There are other reasons that archaeologists, and not just archaeologists, might record historic buildings. There are community archaeology. Hopefully, if some of you who are watching along find that this interests you, this is something that you can actually do possibly to your own homes or to local buildings, just to get an idea of a better understanding of the structure. It's a fun way of using the built environment to build up a skill set. Academic studies, research projects, and personal interest are all ways that might trigger a historic buildings recording. What do we produce when we do these recordings? Because it's all well and good saying, yes, we're doing this, but there are actual documents that might come out of the back end of it. Things like historic environment assessments, where you're looking at the general area around the building. There are 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in London. And of those 4, 3 of them, it could be argued, are protecting an entire environment. because it's not just single buildings that are important, but how they interact with each other. The actual look of them as a whole can, to some extent, tell us a lot about the societies that constructed those built environments. If you're interested, the four are the Tower of London, Kew Gardens, Westminster, and Maritime Greenwich. Great pub quiz knowledge. Survey and report on discharging planning conditions. That's what we were talking about when we were referencing the legal underpinning of the protection of archaeology. Conservation area appraisals to see whether a new area is going to be given conservation legislation and protection, or to just see what standard of protection is currently in place in a conservation area. Conservation management plans. It's all well and good saying that you're going to look after a historic building, but unless you have a specific plan of what you're going to do in various circumstances, it might not necessarily, you need to know what condition, as it says here, condition survey, you need to know what condition and what kind of problems you might come across if you are going to try and preserve a historic building. There, as we're going to see, are lots of different materials that may be involved in the construction of a building, and each one of them might require a different plan on how one might protect it and preserve it for future generations. So, as I said, when people talk about archaeology, they tend to be thinking about the below ground digging stuff. But if you do get them to start thinking about historic buildings, this is the kind of thing that they think about would be recorded by a historic standing building specialist. This is Knowle House. It's a very grand 14th century mansion house. I think it's the largest in the UK. Grade 1 listed, absolute sort of like apex historical site. Lots of interesting things. Linked to Vita Sackville West, I think, and various other people. So a really interesting site. However, that is not the only kind of building that may be involved in a historic standing buildings recording. This is the wide selection of different kinds of sites that are similarly historically pertinent. If you only do grade 1 listed buildings, if you only look at castles and palaces and grand houses, you will only learn about how the top 1% of a society lived. You might learn a little bit about the artisans and the people who built it, but your focus is very narrow. As such, like any other archaeological investigation, it is important to look at sites of various different statuses, locations, uses, functions, all of that. If I can remember correctly, looking at the top left of the screen, we have that's Foyles in London, St Lawrence's Church in Brentford, Drapers Halls, the West Ham Baptist Tabernacle, Canons Ashby in the middle, good. This is testing me more than anything else. The German Gymnasium near King's Cross, a school site that we did, Marshgate Lane, which was a glass bending factory, and the Peabody Estate. And as you can see, just in these few buildings here, that is a wide variety of purposes, locations, materials being used. It shows you how broad a subject historic standing buildings can be. What specifically do we record? This is a very important list. So if you're watching along now, or I believe this is going up on YouTube afterwards, this is the bit to pause or screenshot, because this is the important things, the actual nuts and bolts of what you'll be looking at if you're on site doing historic standing buildings recording. Nailed that water section. So let's go through them individually now. Location. It sounds simple enough, but you need to know where the building is that you are talking about. This is important, one, for some of the implications of what you might learn about the local area through the building, and two, if anyone is using your records later, they need to know where the building is. If they want to revisit it, if they want to do any more work, it is important to put things like the name of the building, the address, the postcode, the national grid reference. it is a basic admin thing that you need to know where it is. But as I said, knowing where a building is starts to already give you ideas of things that you may infer from it, the structure. For example, you might start seeing specific kinds of buildings turning up in certain locations. For example, apologies, there are not very many ports on mountaintops. So you are, you're starting to narrow down the kind of buildings you might find. Secondly, the location might tell you something about what kinds of building materials you may see. For example, the vernacular architecture of Yorkshire, the older buildings may be using material that is close at hand and easy to move because the buildings are constructed prior to the invention of mass communication, mass transport. As such, a lot of the vernacular buildings there are made from stone. Move to Norwich and sort of East Anglia area, less stone, less geographical material available. So you're going to see more buildings using brick, tile, and timber in their construction. So first of all, knowing where the building is, you're going in, you're starting to expect certain building materials to be used in historic structures, which means, again, if you start seeing maybe a stone building in East Anglia, that immediately tells you this is probably a more high status building. Money's had to be put into it. Where does the stone come from? Has it been shipped in? A good example of this, apologies. A good example of this could be the discovery of Caen stone, literally from the Normandy region of France, named for the city of Caen. Those stones have been found in the construction of the Tower of London. Now we know the Tower of London's in London, and we know that Caen stone is from northern France, so there is a specific choice has been made to move that material across the water, and it is essentially a status, an imposition of power through the choice of building materials. 4. The shape of the building, roof type, chimneys, orientation. Orientation is quite important as well. For certain buildings like churches, the orientation may be on east-west lines to make sure that they're lining up towards Jerusalem. Or the orientation of the building could be something to do with the landscape. Is the structure being turned to take a south face to get more sunlight into it? Or is it dealing with other landscape, like hills, rivers, other aspects of it that may be influencing how the building has been constructed? There's a couple of words here that are important in how one would write a description. Elevations, bays, and stories. Elevations when you're doing a drawing of the outside of a structure as you're looking at it, which is something we'll discuss later on. But the use of the terms bays and stories is important. When you are writing a description of a building, you need to make sure that someone who isn't yourself could pick those notes up and read them at a later date. And one way of doing that is to separate the structure into constituent parts when you're talking about it. So I'm going to just nip back very quickly to Knoll House. If you look at this building and you wanted to describe all of the features along that front, it would be a very long, very dense description potentially. But you can separate that elevation into separate sections. So bays are when there is a vertical line between grouped features. This is a really good example of it because there's actually, you can see there's a slightly, each bay is actually separated by a slightly stuck out section. And so in each one of those bays, you would have one of those gable ends and 3 windows in it. And that would be one bay. If you write in that description, you could go bay 1, bay 2, bay 3, bay 4, and anyone coming up subsequently would be able to see what your numbering pattern is and understand exactly which section of the elevation you're describing. A story is a horizontal demarcation between each of the floors of the building, or each of the features. So in this instance, a bay there, you could say, would have 3 stories. Window on ground floor, first floor, and second floor. So in this particular example of Knoll House, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 bays, 3 stories. That's how you would separate up that building. Function, again, certain buildings will have certain terminology linked to them. Military structures, for example, will have things like pillboxes, possibly trenches, other defensive structures that you wouldn't see in other buildings. Similarly, ecclesiastical structures will have elements of it that are specific to worship that you wouldn't see elsewhere. Industrial buildings the same. So knowing the function of the building will tell you potentially what kind of things within it, what kind of architectural forms you may encounter whilst recording it. And also understanding the function of the building, if there are any of those features missing, it tells you there's something interesting going on as well. And there may have been a change in function on the site. Materials, we've already discussed it briefly, but certain choices may be made for like status symbols, but also for technological reasons, you might go with different materials as well. Brick becomes more popular because it's easier to handle. It's easier for an individual to transport it around. It's a much more modular construction form, which is why it takes precedence. Anytime that you start choosing stone after that, you're making more of a sort of like an architectural or aesthetic choice. Setting, what's around it? Buildings do not exist in a vacuum. That is really important. Buildings are influenced by what is nearby. So the whole environment needs to be taken into context when you're talking about that building, whether it is unusual or very usual for its surroundings. Context, similarly, is there anything like it locally, regionally, nationally? Phasing, which we already discussed briefly, not just how it was constructed, but repairs, alterations, remodeling, and rebuilds. History, that's cool as well. Are there specific architects involved in it? If anyone has been to Barcelona, for example, anything by Gaudi stands out a mile from all the buildings around it because it's got these unusual, very naturalistic forms, and understanding that you are dealing with a building with possibly a very specific architect will tell you what kind of things you're expecting to see. And significance. How rare, how aesthetically attractive is it, and what may have happened within that building are all things that you would consider when you are doing a historic standing building survey. Now, there are different kinds of level of recording. I am going to talk to you most about how to do a level 2 recording. These are the most regular that you would see, but very quickly, just to run through them. Level 1, basic visual recording, pretty much just using photography to show what you saw on the day that you visited. This is good for low status, low significant buildings, things like prefabricated structures that are part of a complex of buildings. They still need to be recorded to understand how they sit within the complex, but may not be as significant as other structures. Also, you can do a level 1 if you're doing, as we said, one of those landscape surveys. If you've got a lot of buildings to cover, this is a very quick way of getting around it. And the visual record does allow you to revisit it later and have a look to see if there's anything that you need to add to the record, or anything that needs another, maybe a higher level record at a later date. Descriptive record has everything that a level 1 does, but you include drawings and a written description of the things that you see. Written descriptions are surprisingly sort of like sneakily tricky. If you get a chance, if you're watching this later, and you can pause the video now, or if you get a chance later, just get a bit of paper, look at the wall that's opposite you, and try in about a 5-minute period writing every feature on it. you will find that it is incredibly difficult to do. And the more that you look at it, the more features you realize and the greater detail you have to go into it. Descriptive record, people, it's only a level 2, but when you're doing it, you're writing a description of the floor, the material, the orientation of any floorboards that you have down there, any marks, any repairs, any sort of like evidence that there's something being sat on the floor and removed, and that's just the floor. You then have to describe all of the walls, the ceiling, any other features in the build, in the structure as well, external features, internal features. It's a very involved process, but it's probably, if you are going to do a building, doing the written description first is very, very useful because it makes you look in detail at what you are going to be discussing. It's a good way of going about things. Analytical record is everything in levels 1 and 2, but you don't just write what you can see, you try and say why it's there. So instead of saying there's a blocked door in that wall, you say there's a blocked door in that wall, which I think is because they've closed that building off and knocked down that wing, so they don't need a door anymore. All right? It's the same sort of level of description, but you're trying to find reason behind it. And finally, there's the level 4, which is essentially writing a book. Building materials. Obviously, it's a huge part of understanding a structure is what is it physically made of? And the choices that are made by the architect, by the builder, by the craftsman, and by the commissioner in what material is used can tell you a great deal about that individual and about sort of the surrounding area in general. Take, for example, this house. This is called the paper house for very obvious reasons, that it's made predominantly from papier-mâché. As you can see on the image on the right, some of the words from the paper that was used is still visible. This is a particularly unusual choice of building material. So then you need to ask, why was this selected? Obviously it was chosen as a sort of something that would be an oddity, be a peculiar thing, maybe as a tourist attraction. But what is particularly interesting is that Elias Stenman, the commissioner of this building, is the man who made his money from designing the machines that make paper clips. So the building material in this instance probably has a very sentimental value to the man who commissioned the building. Types of building material will change over time. And the reasons that you choose those building materials will change over time. Take this section of the Roman wall. As you can see, there are various repairs which are represented in different materials, and there are lots of different uses of material. There's tile in there from the Roman period, there's stone, there's flints, forming kind of an aesthetic line of patterning across it, and there's brick as well. And that shows the stone and things that are being chosen probably for their strength, and it's still a defensive structure, whereas the brick may not necessarily be used, facing the same potential threats as a stone wall, and maybe being chosen because of its value, cost, accessibility, the shapes that can be formed using it. So there's lots of different things that you can infer from the building material used. For example, here we have a slate roof on Magdalen College, in Oxford. This building is from the 15th century, but the first recorded use of slate as a roof is probably in Wales in about the 1300s, and not much outside of Wales until the 19th century. So either what you have here is a building where incredible levels of cost have been made to bring slate to it for its original construction, or more likely, this is a re-tiling of the roof using a material that only becomes readily available in the area of Oxford after mass transit makes it so. So understanding the history of those building materials can start to unpick the history of the building itself. Or you can see in things like this, predominantly constructed out of red brick. That is the main choice, but it would seem that the architect has decided to use stone to accentuate all of the architectural features within the elevation. And my God, there are lots of them. This is sometimes referred to as a new Baroque building, and uses all sorts of different elements from a very triangular pediment over the third bay, sort of the central one there, Roman arches, aspects of architectural forms that come from earlier buildings, earlier architectural styles expressed here. We don't have time to get into the names for all of the features that you will find on buildings. Even when I was doing this as a half-day course, there are too many of them to come across. Look, if you wanted to get a really good basis for understanding how a lot of architectural terms are based on, learn about classical architecture and Gothic architecture in the UK. There's a great deal of elements that are linked to those forms that are still expressed in buildings many millennia after the original invention of those architectural styles. For example, as I've already noted, this building here includes arches, Romanesque arches. It has, on the bottom floor there, if you can see, there's towards the right-hand side, there's striped lines. That's interesting because that is a style that comes from essentially Renaissance and 17th century stately homes, which is, you can still see it reflected in smaller domestic buildings, those sort of things that came from Palladio and architects of that period, constantly being reflected in later structures. And the reason I'm floundering around is I've forgotten the name of it. And what'll happen is in about 10 minutes time, I'll remember what that's called and I will shout it randomly. Other choices of building materials can be purely from an architectural form, or can allow new shapes to be made in the building. For example, here, concrete allows for very angular shaped structure. You can see the constraints of the building material in this one. You couldn't necessarily make as striking a structure out of brick or stone as you can out of concrete. And the modular formation of the building can lead to really interesting. I'll be honest, I really enjoy brutalism. I know a lot of people don't, but I find this very beautiful. So it can also have a really, to some people, an aesthetic enjoyment to certain building materials. And it's important to understand the history of lots of different building materials, because you can see in this one, structures aren't necessarily going to be made out of one thing. You're going to need to learn the words and the reasons why these structures are being used for a whole variety of them, because buildings over time will include lots of different building materials. Describing buildings. This is worth looking at. This is a very basic recording sheet that if you were going to record a building of your own, this is what you would use. Building name, as we said, let us know what you're recording. Room. Just like, as I mentioned earlier, the elevation with the bays and with the stories, you should also have a numbering system for each individual room. Again, so that if anyone comes to your records afterwards, they are able to know exactly which building you are, which room you are referring to with the description. The easiest way of doing this is to get a plan drawing of each floor, and when you're doing your initial walkover to get a feel of the building, number each room as you go, and then stick to that numbering system. I usually tend to say, like, do G1, G2, meaning ground floor 1, ground floor 2, F1, F2, first floor 1, S2, it helps keeping in that kind of uniform way of numbering things as you go through the building so you don't get confused. Date, so you know exactly when you were looking at the building so that you any subsequent changes will be identifiable because of the discrepancy in the records. Who wrote it, so people can come and ask you what it was that you were talking about, and the description itself. Everything that we had in that list, the shape, windows, materials, etc., etc. I fully recommend trying this out in your own room right now. Not right now, but in your own rooms, because you will find out how involved it is. And these are the kind of things that you should look for when you are writing a description to give you some of the clues as to how the building has changed. Symmetry. Symmetry appeals to the eye. So when an architect is creating a building, they may, not always, but they may want to make it a symmetrical form so that it looks like a pleasing building. That helps us to see whether things were constructed at the same time. Like, for example, the west front of Wells Cathedral here, as you can see, the whole front of it, the bottom half, is a really incredibly symmetrical structure. It's a single design, single phase of construction, as are the towers. The towers are built at a later date to the west front, but you can see that the towers themselves maintain symmetry between each other. So if you were looking at this building, you would see that the architectural forms and the styles may change between the upper and lower to tell you the date changes. Excuse me. But the similarity between the two towers, whilst not touching each other, let you know that these are probably from the same date or from a similar construction, as they are being made to match each other. So look for symmetry. Even if things aren't matching, it can tell you that they are same phase of construction. Asymmetry, the opposite of symmetry, can tell you that something's gone on. And if you look at Ely Cathedral here, you can see that clearly something has gone awry. There is symmetry in all of the structures that have been put onto things. There's even probably likely to be symmetry between those octagonal towers if you're looking at another elevation. But when you're looking this side, you can see that there's a difference between the transept at the, probably would be the southeast and the northwest side of the building. That is because there was a collapse. And subsequently, if you look very carefully, you can see that there's a diagonal of stonework still abutting the side of the main cathedral structure to support the walls to prevent any further collapse. If you see something like this, where clearly you're expecting symmetry in a building and it isn't there, it tells you to look closer because something has happened. In this case, bad foundations. Straight joints. Something has to have been built before something else can be built against it. It's the most simplest way of extending a structure is to have these straight wall lines between them, the abutting brickwork, stonework, whatever. If you see one of these, you know that you're looking at least two phases of construction. You'll also see other things in there as well. You can see that one side of the building appears to have been maybe whitewashed. You can see that that stops clean on the line as well. You can see the different roofing materials, the change in the roof line. That's a straight joint as well. And you can see the difference between the amount of windows on one side and no windows present on the other, suggesting there may even be an internal change in function between the two elements of the building. At the bottom there, in the bottom right-hand corner, as you look at the screen, there's a phasing map for this structure, excuse me, which we will get to when we're talking about the plans. But that is basically a visual way of showing the different periods of major construction represented in each building. Blocked openings. These are fun. This one is a particularly interesting one because there's a lot of things going on. First of all, I would draw your attention at the end of the gangway, you can see just the small outline at the bottom of the wall of a step and what appears to be the demarcation line of a door. There is another one at the other end of the elevation underneath the window at the left-hand side, but those doors don't go all the way up. They stop, and you can follow along. There is very clearly a line, a change in the brickwork. So this suggests there are 3 phases at least going on here. Actually, I'd say 4, because if you look at the actual building material in the 2 doors, you can see even between those 2, the brickwork being used is different. So it would suggest that maybe they were bricked up at a different time. So I'd say that you've got the principal build with maybe 1 or 2 doors. One of the doors could be a later addition. You know, that's something that you'd look at. Then those doors have been bricked up, probably at different times because the brickwork is different. So there's your 3 phases so far. And then the entire top of the building has been reconstructed with your 4th change in brickwork and the cut-off of the bricked in doorways that were there. So there you go. Just a couple of bits of brick, but they tell you something of the sequence of the structure. This is some more blocked doorways, but tells you something potentially about status as well. Because if you can have a look here, you've got the large arches of the city walls of Southampton. And behind that, the central column right in the middle of the picture, you can see that there is just in the brickwork a small blocked doorway. Those were entrances to common folks' houses, which were, in no uncertain terms, told that they would have to lose their doors because they were going to build a great big city wall after a raid by the French in 1338. So not only are we seeing a phasing difference, we might be able to start understanding something about power structures, about status within this society, and how some buildings can be essentially, you know, dwellings can be sacrificed for what is seen as a greater protective need. So just a few bits of stone, but they tell you more. Dating plaques. These are tricky beasts and not always to be trusted. You can see here that set into the building work, they have a date for it. Fine, great. That is a perfect system and something that you can at least start on with your historical research. It's a good starting date, but it's only a good thing in a world where people don't ever move buildings or you reuse architectural features, like here, for example. The date on the plaque is 1588, but the building itself that it's set into is late 18th, early 19th century. So if you were just going to use the evidence of the plaque itself, you'd be out by 300 odd years. So don't always trust them. You can use them as a jumping off point, but it's important to look at the building as a whole and look at the setting as a whole before you start jumping to conclusions. Similarly, you've got to look at the whole building. And I use this as I usually ask people at this point, how old do you think this building is, just based on this elevation? And I give them a bit of time to work it out. I wouldn't mind some guesses in the chats as well, why not? This has an architectural style called Strawberry Hill Gothic, as copied, you know, influenced by Strawberry Hill House and Horace Walpole. It's very nice. Sort of like 18th century builds, that kind of thing, late 17th century. However, it's only one part of the building. See, someone wanted to update the structure, but didn't want to pay for the whole thing to be rebuilt. So you've got a 17th century building at the back, and you've got an 18th century building structure just facing it on the front. So remember, the whole building needs to be taken into account to understand its history. And then you get things like this. This is Reigate Castle and is very annoying. It is an 18th century folly. There's lots of clues as to why this isn't a real castle. For a start, if you stood in front of one of those arrow slits, you would definitely die. What's annoying about it is it's built on the site of an 11th century castle, and it's using material robbed out from this older structures that stood on the site. So in this instance, you need to look at the actual execution and the form of the building, because in the building material is older and may lie to you. I ran into this the other day up in Hornsey. There's what appears to be a very nice medieval church tower there, and I was pontificating on how beautiful it was until I read the note next to it and realised that it had been reconstructed in the 19th century, and I am a fool. So yes, got to watch out for those kind of things. Elements of the building. We're just going to very quickly go through these because they're interesting and they can tell you things, but windows aren't just windows. They could tell you a lot about the society that they're in. For example, there are technological changes that can occur. The very small windows, probably because you're having to blow the glass and you can't make great big panes, whereas in the later 19th century, you're able to float glass and you can get a much larger thing from it. Things like the early 19th century one there, where you see the window bars, the margin lights and the large pane of glass, that's essentially a social status thing. The glass tax came in and tax was put on each pane of glass by weight. So if you had the money to show off that you could afford big panes of glass, you put them in like that and you were essentially saying, I'm incredibly wealthy. There's other things like the requirement that there be a windowsill and that windows be set back 3 inches is as a response to the Great Fire of London. It's a fire prevention thing. Lots of different elements of it you can learn from that. Bricks, I won't go into too much detail, but again, screenshot this one. These are the main sort of bonds that you may come across. English bond, if you see the side of a brick, we refer to that as a stretcher. If you see the head of the brick, we refer to that as a header. English bond, you get an entire line of stretchers followed underneath by an entire line of headers, followed by stretchers, followed by headers. That's an English bond. Flemish bond, probably the other one that you need to know. That one goes header, stretcher, stretcher along the same course. The English cross bond and the English garden wall are slight variations on what the English bond is. English cross, look very carefully at the image and you'll see that the end of the stretcher, two courses above, corresponds with the middle of the next line of stretchers. That's why it's a cross bond instead of straight on top of each other. And the English garden wall uses fewer header courses. It's not as structurally sound, hence its predominant use in garden walls. Brick measurements we've not got time for, but again, an interesting one to look at. The sizes of them might be able to tell you something about the history, the period that it's been constructed in, or things like the 1784 brick tax. The Wilkes gobs were insanely large bricks that were created because a tax was put on each individual brick to pay for the war effort in the American War of Independence. And brickmakers responded to that by making bigger bricks, so you didn't need to make as many, which meant you weren't as taxed on as many, and people just had these huge sort of chunks in their walls. And this came to a very quick end when the government spotted that and said, okay, there's 2 rates of tax. There's a normal tax and a super tax on big bricks. And everyone went, oh no, we just make normal bricks, sorry very much. So again, that's a nice dating one. If you see one of those big bricks, it can date the building to a very 17-year period. But it also tells you things about what's happening in the society that's created those buildings. Other recording methods. Annotations, notes, we've covered. Drawings, that's a really important one, really helps you get your eye in. Photography, laser scanning, dendrochronology, and documentary research. Drawings can be as simple as this. This is just a measured sketch, or this is a sketch in this instance, of a timber roof, and it's been used to denote which of the rafters have carpenter's marks on and what those carpenter's marks are. It doesn't have to be at scale, it just has to have, in this instance, it lets you know where the drawing starts, where it finishes, some orientation. The main information that you're imparting is not the exact dimensions, but just where things are in the building. so not necessarily as important as this. This is a scale drawing. In this instance, you literally just put a string line out, put a line level on it, put a tape measure up, and measure along every single point by hand. You get a very accurate drawing of the structure. You get a really good eye on everything, so you can see any features that you've missed when you've been doing the description. And you can take something like this, and it does take time, and you can put it into CAD, and you can produce something like this. Quite an elegant elevation of the building. Plans to show how the building floors, how different rooms interact with each other. It could tell you all sorts of things about possible uses for rooms. Rule of thumb is if you have to go through more doors to get to a room, the more private or more sort of like high status that important it is to the building's function is. Think, for example, how many doors you have to get through to get to your bedroom. Or if you were in a bank, how many doors would you have to get through to get to the safe? Just understanding the plan and the route of the building can tell you something about the uses of it. Sectional elevations, similarly, allows you to understand the space a little bit better. This is, for example, Greenwich Pumping House. So it was important to get a sectional view of the structure so we could understand how all the different elements of it work together. Phase plans, as we've discussed, you can see here that each part of the building has been identified with a period, and this lays out very clearly how the structure has developed from that principal build out from the core. And you can also see from that how much of the principal build had been removed, how much of the medieval material has gone, so that whilst it's still in the core, it's not the full building that is surviving. Photography. As I said, with a level 1, this is the most basic recording method. You can see here that photography, people are like, well, why don't you just take photographs? Why do you draw? And this is the reason why. Photographs are really good, but they can't possibly show you everything. And there's some instances where the angle that you're at or the space that you're working in won't allow you to get a good shot using just cameras. So in those instances, you want to do both. You want to draw it so you can see every feature, and you want to photograph it so that you have a visual record of what the space looked like when you were there. Laser scanning is quite a fun thing as well. You would use a laser scanning. This is a beautiful example. As I said, putting a line level up and drawing each individual brick, great, fantastic. If your elevation is flat, if it's like this, curved, you're going to make a really awkward drawing. And I know that from having to try and draw a horse gin. Very difficult. In those instances, bring a laser scanner in if you can get hold of one, scan the whole wall, and just relax. There's one other recording technique which I haven't got here, but I think it's worth mentioning, is photogrammetry. Every time you take a digital image, information is recorded within that image. Not just the visual aspects of it, but also things like how long the light takes to get from the object you are photographing to the light sensor in the digital camera. This includes cameras on mobile phones as well. You can take that information, you can feed it into a computer program, and it can build 3D models using just the photographs that you have taken. You don't need to do any laser scanning previously. You can do it just using those photographs. And if you want an example of that, once we're finished here, I would suggest that you go and look at Sketchfab, a website called Sketchfab, and look for MOLA's page on Sketchfab. And you will see 3D models of some of the structures that we worked on, which allow you to manipulate them, embed extra information. They're a really interesting resource and worth having a look at. Now, I realize that we're coming to the end of the allotted hour. So this is pretty much the end of what you need to know practically on how to do a historic standing buildings recording. A brief overview, if you will. There's so much more that you can learn. But if you have any questions, I will come to them now. So I'm just going to open up the chat function and see what we have going. And and welcome anyone from Layers of London or anything to chip back in as well, so I don't sit here in silence.
Just to say, this is Adam from Layers of London. Just to say a massive thanks, Paul. That was a really fantastic and really interesting presentation you just gave. I think there might be a few questions or things coming into the chat now. And also, if anyone wants to raise their hand or has their hand raised, they could leave a question in the chat as well. So, or the Q&As. So one of the questions we have is will this video be available? And yes, we have recorded this webinar, so it will be available on the Layers of London's YouTube channel from if not this afternoon, tomorrow, or next week. So look out for that one. And I think there might be a question in the Q&As. There's a many thanks for the presentation, so thank you for that. We do still have a bit of time for questions if anyone has any. Looks like everyone's happy.
That's brilliant.
In which case, I will just simply say thank you once again, Paul. That was really fantastic. And
thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for having me. And I think, is there a question there?
I think it's all lots of thanks. Everyone's really enjoyed it. So lots of praise coming in. And, and indeed,
I'll take it.
There is one question. Do you have any book recommendations?
Yes, absolutely. I've got them right here. Rice's Architectural Primer, which is a really cracking one when you're trying to talk about the actual words that you need to use to describe the architectural forms. It's also really cool because it has tons of really nice pictures, so you can sort of like work out exactly what it is that you're looking at just by looking through the book. And if you are going to get into it in a big way, may I suggest Pevsner's, anything from Pevsner. This one's quite useful, the glossary, but also Pevsner was a really interesting chap who decided that he'd try to write a description of every historic building in England, which is a huge undertaking. And he is basically the starting point for a lot of listings of historic buildings on Historic England, how the listings service for that. And some of his listings are incredibly detailed, but others, he sat in a two-seater sports car driven by a student, and he just drove past the house and went, oh, looks about Gothic, and wrote essentially that. Scottish Arc website or English Architect. Do I have any advice for building archaeologists trying to start out a career in the heritage sector? I got into it quite luckily. The company I was working for had an opening, and I just showed an interest in the buildings. But it's, I think the only way you can really go about it is practice some of the techniques. If you can come to interviews showing like examples of your work, that's really good, because it's such a specific skill that if people can see that you have an ability to do particularly things like the drawing, or if you can get experience using CAD or any other computer aided designs, or if you can get experience building photogrammetry models, that will put you in good stead as well. Essentially, it's just get out there, build up the knowledge set, and hopefully, you know, when an opportunity arises, you can show yourself to be the person for the job. It was, yes, sorry, I can see one on the question and answer here. So what was the 3D modeling thingamy called? Sketchfab. And look for MOLA on Sketchfab.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again, Paul. I think we might end it there. And
Yes.
thanks to everybody who attended this webinar, and the thanks that you've been writing on the chat as well. As we said, it's been recorded and it will feature on the Layers of London's YouTube channel, hopefully at the end of the day, or if not, then definitely by next week. So stay safe, everyone. And one more thing.
Yeah, I've just remembered the word. It's rustication. Oh my God.
We knew it would come back to you.
Oh, that took a long time. All right. Bye, everyone.
We got it in. We got it in. Excellent stuff. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye.